Hey everyone, and welcome to the Rewriting Crash Course. So in this series of videos, what I'm going to be doing is helping you rewrite that first draft. So you finished that draft, right? You finally gotten to the end of this story. Now, how do you fix it? Okay, you know it's probably not quite working, but you're not exactly sure how to find your story's problems, fix them, and create the story that you want to actually write. So in this series, that's what I'm going to be showing you how to do, how to actually rewrite a first draft. Now, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one on rewriting your story, then there's a link to book a call to talk to me about that in the description below. So if that's something you're interested in, if you want to work with me one-on-one, you can check that out. And let's just hop right into the video here. Episode 1. This is going to be about two main elements that you need to start with. So first off, we're going to be talking about awareness. I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that shortly. The other main topic we will be discussing today is organization. Actually organizing your story. And what I mean by organization is figuring out where to start with this draft, right? You have all these pieces and this puzzle that's sort of connecting, and some scenes are working and some characters aren't working, and you're just confused. We're going to organize that story and actually figure out how to make it good. Okay. So starting out with awareness here. Okay. So first off, the biggest thing you need to know right off the bat is that your first draft is not your final story. Now that sounds obvious, right? Of course, your first draft is not your story. You know this. But the problem is writers finish their first draft and assume that they only need to fix a couple scenes, maybe fix some grammar, maybe go back and make a couple of dialogue changes. And this is simply not going to cut it, okay? So if you are a new writer meaning you have written less than 10 screenplays, your story probably needs a lot of work, and it most likely needs a page 1 rewrite, a complete and total rewrite. Now, that's usually hard to hear. You know, it's not easy to be told that none of your story is worth keeping and you need to reevaluate the entire thing and start again. But that's probably the case. I realize this is hard to hear, but if you aren't at least willing to do a page 1 rewrite, you should probably click away now, because no matter what, even if you are an experienced writer, sometimes you're going to be going back to the drawing board and starting again. So if you're not here committed to actually getting your story to where you want it to be, then this series is probably just not going to be for you. Tell yourself your story is probably not there yet. It probably needs that page 1 rewrite. The biggest thing here is just about ego, right? Your ego is the biggest thing that's going to get in the way of your writing, okay? You cannot fix problems if you are constantly worrying about your own ego, right? So you have an ego investment in your work, right? You've just written 120 pages. Oh my gosh, it took you 2 years to get this thing done. Why would you just go back to the very beginning and start from page 1? So this is your ego talking, and you need to realize that you're just simply not where you need to be yet in your writing. So our focus is on fixing problems, not padding your ego, not padding my ego, not padding anyone's. So assume your draft needs that page 1 rewrite. I might sound like a broken record here, or I'm overly focusing on this, but one of the biggest problems I've seen when I work with people one-on-one is they simply cannot admit that their story isn't where it should be. And they simply cannot admit the fact that they have huge mistakes in their writing. And a lot of people are walking around assuming that if that one producer read their work, then they would be a professional writer. They would, write the next hugely successful franchise and everything would be great. It's probably not the case. So this is going to be a big part. So once you have now accepted that, right? Okay, my first draft is not completed. There's going to be a lot of work to be done in the future to actually get my writing where I want it to be. Now, if you can commit to this process and actually say, okay, I do want to be a screenwriter, I am serious about this, then great. Now we can move on to organization. When we're talking about organization, what I'm saying here is that it doesn't make sense to fix dialogue in a particular scene if that scene shouldn't be in your story in the first place, right? Okay, so it probably doesn't make sense to fix the scene if the character in this scene shouldn't be in your story in the first place, right? So what you need to then realize is that there are certain parts of your story that are more important and other parts that are less important, right? So for example, dialogue is not the make or break element of your screenplay, right? Because characters speak dialogue. If the character doesn't need to be in the story, then the dialogue doesn't matter because it shouldn't be there at all. And so what we essentially need to do is, how do we figure out what the most important part of this big old mess is when we're trying to figure out whether or not your story is working? A big lesson I learned was from the screenwriter Michael Arndt. And Michael Arndt put out this video, I'll leave it in the description below, called Endings, the Good, the Bad, and the Insanely Great. And what he talks about in this video is why a lot of stories don't work, okay? So, you know, the main character gets the girl, or the girl gets the job, or the main character robs the bank, or they win the race, but who cares, right? Why is that important? Why does it matter whether or not your protagonist gets what they want? Why does it matter whether or not they build the company or win the competition, right? Why does it matter? Okay. So what Michael Arndt looked at was that a lot of people talk about the internal and external stakes of a story. So obviously we're familiar with external stakes, the actual plot events that are happening. You know, your character wants to win the race. And then we know a lot about the internal stakes, right? So your character is unsure of themselves and whether or not they can win the race, and they're having that internal struggle. That's your internal stakes, right? What Michael Arndt talks about is the third layer of stakes, which is the philosophical layer, right? So what he's saying is what makes your story actually work is what is philosophically at stake, right? So it's not just about whether or not your character wins the race or whether or not they have self-doubt about whether they can win the race, but it is their beliefs that they hold about life and about how it should be lived that then set up your entire story. Okay, so why are the philosophical stakes important? Okay, well, to understand this, we need to understand what the purpose of story is at all. Why do stories exist in the human psyche? What's their purpose? Why do we tell them? Okay, it's not simply to just entertain each other. It is more than that, right? Stories exist to study meaning, right? Stories exist to help us examine what is the best way to live. Stories exist to help us make the right choice in a moral, ethical, or philosophical dilemma. Okay, so it's not about whether or not your character wins the race. It is about the beliefs that they hold of why winning this race is valuable to their life, to meaning, and who they are as a person, that then defines whether or not we want them to win the race as the audience. Okay, so essentially what your story does is your story studies meaning, okay? Okay, so your story studies meaning. Okay, now when we're looking at this, how does a story study meaning? That's probably your next question here. If you look at the videos on my channel and you look at the purpose of conflict, looking at the videos I've made on the purpose of conflict, what you will see is me examining the philosophical conflict in stories. I'm looking at the Shawshank Redemption and how the beliefs of the characters create the dilemma of the film. I also look at Sicario, and I've looked at a myriad of different films on my YouTube channel, looking at how stories study meaning through philosophical conflict, okay? The base level of your story is going to be this right here, okay? Your story is going to study meaning, right? Your story is going to have a philosophical, ethical, or moral dilemma. And it has this because stories are guides to life, okay? Stories essentially examine characters making choices that hold meaning. And those meaningful choices is what actually creates the emotion that you feel when you are watching a film, okay? So can you have roller coaster films where this is not as important? Yes, you can. You can have stories that are just tightly wound, thrillers, or you can have stories that are mysteries that do not have this. But this is the core of how stories work. And just because every single story does not hold it, Usually what this means is you have more of a roller coaster, entertaining story that doesn't have longer term weight. And there's absolutely a place for these kinds of stories. It's not immediately what we're going to be looking at here. Okay, so now that we, okay, so I've just thrown this big concept at you about philosophical conflict and why it matters. Essentially, even if you are writing a more of a roller coaster type story, where you're writing a thriller, you're writing a story that doesn't have that strong philosophical conflict, it still can be important to build it, because what defines characters is that philosophical conflict. Okay, so let's say the most important part of your story is going to be the philosophical, moral, or ethical dilemma. Okay, this is the most important part of your story. Okay, everything flows out of this. Why? Now let's take a look at characters. Okay, characters are the next most important part of your story. Why? Because characters hold beliefs that relate to the philosophical, ethical, or moral dilemma of your story. If you look at Shawshank Redemption, the entire story is about hope versus despair. And the main character in the film holds a high level of hope for the future, and no matter his situation, he remains hopeful. In the entire story, characters challenge his belief in hope, right? They challenge his will to continue. They challenge his optimism. They challenge his hope. There are other characters like Red in the story that flip-flop from feeling that hope to feeling despair, feeling that hope to feeling despair, right? So the characters are defined by the philosophical, moral, or ethical beliefs that they hold, okay? So because your characters hold these beliefs, your characters are defined by the philosophical conflict. The philosophical conflict is the most important part of your story, followed by your characters and how you build them. And remember that we're looking at this as a bird's eye view. Each video going forward is going to look at each part of this in more detail. Don't freak out if you're like totally confused and you feel like I'm going too fast. Okay, I'm going to go very slowly through each of this and explain why this is as important as it is. The next most important part of your story, this comes to what people love and hate in their writing, which is structure. Okay, so what happens is once you have this right here, once you have this is the core of your story right here. Okay, so you can write a fantastic story with just these two elements, never ever thinking about this. This is also why they are the most important, right? The core of a story is about human beings holding beliefs and acting in the world, and the world reacting against them. That is the most, if we take away climaxes and act turning points and pinch points and all of that stuff that we put in screenplays and genres and blah, 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 the core of a story, right, outside of books and movies and all these things, is characters holding beliefs, interacting with the world, and the world reacting against them. And this sort of flow and trying to find the best way to live, okay? So then what we do as screenwriters is we take this core element of story, right, and then we put it into a structure that works for us, right? When I talk about structure more so, I'll talk about, there are organic elements of structure, and you can see that in the structure videos that I have made previously, but it is not the most important part. And structural rules can be broken to fit the philosophical conflict that you are trying to tell the audience. Under this, right, under these three things, now we get into even lesser important parts. So genre conventions, right? What are the genre conventions in your story? Are you telling a thriller? What are the genre conventions of a thriller? How can you subvert the genre and prop up the genre? What do people know about the type of story that you are trying to tell that creates audience expectation? All of these sorts of things. But notice that it is much lower on the totem pole than some of these more core elements. Under this, we then get into things like scene construction. Scene construction, which is pretty simple, actually building scenes. And then we get into things like dialogue, action lines, grammar, these sorts of final polishing elements of your story. You know, there may be some of you that believe that structure is the most important part of your story. There may be some of you that believe that your dialogue is the most important part of your story. I would say that these are incorrect ideas. The reason for that is because dialogue is built upon your characters, is built upon your genre, is built upon your scene construction. It does not stand alone at all. Your structure, if you don't actually have a real story to tell, it doesn't matter how well structured. There are hundreds of well-structured stories coming out every year that are pieces of crap that nobody cares about, because this is not the fundamental element of why your story works, right? Your story works because characters hold beliefs in regards to your philosophical, moral, ethical dilemma. They make choices because of this dilemma, which we will get into in the next video. And those choices then define your story and actually define the flow of what is going on. This is a lot, right? I have given you a lot of stuff right off the bat, okay? So let me summarize and help you get a clearer understanding of what I've just laid out to you. First and foremost, you need to have the awareness to understand that your story is not there yet, okay? Be willing to go back and write from page 1 once again, okay? I've done full page 1 rewrites multiple times, right? If things are not working, they are not working. And the more that you attach your ego to your story, the worse it gets, okay? Step 2, you need to be able to understand what the most important part of your story is, okay? If all you're doing all the time is moving dialogue around, nothing is going to change. It's not going to get better. If all you're doing is cutting a scene here, adding a scene here, you don't know the reasons for why you are making the choices that you are making, okay? You need to be able to understand what the most important part of your story is, which is this right here, and then from there, you fix accordingly. So you fix the top piece first, you fix the philosophical, moral, ethical dilemma of your story first, then you go down to fix your characters, then you fix your structure, your genre, your scenes, and your dialogue, right? So there is a flow to this. There is an organization to how your story actually gets better. And we are going to be looking at how to actually fix the different parts of your story in the next videos. Now, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one to get your screenplay to the level you want it to be, click that link in the description, and I will see you guys in the next video.